perfect song, Harry.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, New Haven. Salutations, Connecticut. Salutations, Chicago and Illinois. And salutations to the world. This is Jesse Turner, the Readman, and we're on 103.5 FM WNHHLP. And as usual, we got a great show for you. I've got an amazing guest for us, a guest that's worth a lifetime study over there. So we have the fabulous Bill Ayers. Just a quick update, what's going on this week? Well, all of a sudden CNN got excited about Dr. Turner and the CCSU Literacy Center because apparently a high school graduate out of the Hartford Public School systems accepted into the University of Connecticut can't read. And she's suing. And it's a tragic story. But anyway, I did with Danny Friedman was the reporter. His crew came here. And I said, this is not unusual. We've had NFL players. We've had NBL players who have graduated college and claimed the same thing. That's not to make it right. I'm just saying. But anyway, that was the buzz this week around here. But the big buzz for me has been enjoying reading When Freedom is the Question, Abortion is the Answer, and listening to Under the Tree podcasts. And it's almost as if I feel like I'm hanging out under the tree with Bill Ayers. Bill, could you introduce yourself to the audience? Because remember, Harry, just for the public, Harry said you were the buzz of the office at the New Haven Independent, and he said there was a line drawn. Younger people were like, well, who's that? And the older people were like, wow. So anyway, let us know. Tell us who you are.
Well, I don't think that should be any surprise. I am 80 years old, but I'll tell you who I am. My name is Bill Ayers. I live on the south side of Chicago. I am a teacher. I've been a teacher my whole life, been a professor for the last 35 years, retired when I was 65 from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I've been teaching ever since as an adjunct at the University of Chicago, where I teach writing and oral history, at DePaul University, where I teach ethics and education, and at Stateville Prison, where I teach memoir writing. And I've written a couple of memoirs myself. And, I continue to write, struggle, teach, rise up, and resist. That's my avocation. So I'm still at it and still happy to be here.
So that I would say that resistance and stuff, that's your mantra, that's your passion. And we do share some similarities. We may have a 10-year difference. That just means I couldn't join Mark Mason and occupying Columbia University. I couldn't join the Weathermen in Chicago, but I certainly was at all kinds of rallies. And early on, when Jesse Jackson called for people to come to the South African embassy to protest apartheid, I'm one of those 75 that showed up and stuff.
Right.
But I've done that a lot. So we have some similarities in that stuff. Right. So you specifically asked us to have a theme. And I look at it as a question, because if you read the latest book, and Dr. Ayers has over a dozen books, I mean, it's going to take me all summer and maybe all next year to read them all. And he's whet my appetite. I have seen snippets of them before, and I am well aware of an illustrious career, a career that I see as a powerful freedom fighter. But you said, let's use Dr. King's opening to the speech to the community. And it was, and I'd like it because in your book, your latest book, you mix music, that I'm loving that. You mix scripture, you mix literature, and you give us writing prompts. So like I'm finding myself when I'm reading the latest book, people, if you haven't bought the latest book, you have not understood. This is like a coffee shop. This is an independent coffee shop. because today is Black Friday. I have my tie on, and I'm not giving any money, not spending any money to these billionaires and these major corporations. But I will be down at Possible Futures in New Haven with Lauren Anderson, because that's an independent bookstore, and I will be down there, and we're discussing some shows later on. But that, let's make it a question. Why pick that theme? And let's think about it as a question for everyone, because I want the audience today to not think this is a conversation between you and I. I want them to think this is a conversation that's inviting them all to participate in that. So let's start off with that piece. Why Dr. King? Why chaos or community?
Well, I think that, one of the things, I'm glad you started there, because I begin every chapter in this latest book, and I begin every episode of my podcast, as well as every session of my teaching. I begin with a poem, and the purpose of that is to have a moment of Zen where we let go of our rational, linear minds and tap into our emotions, our feelings. And then I always have a writing prompt, and the writing prompts vary. And I can tell you some of the recent ones I use with my students who are inmates. But the one you're talking about is the title of Martin Luther King's last book, which is "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" And I think that putting it that way gives a certain urgency to naming this political moment. And one of the things I think I try to do, I think you try to do, and I think your listeners should try to do every day, is to say, what is this moment we're living in? I wake up every morning, and on my wall, I have a quote from the poet Mary Oliver, and it says, "Just to be alive on this fresh morning in the broken world." And that reminds me that I'm lucky to be alive, that it's a new day, that possibilities are everywhere, but also we live in a broken world. And we ought to be spending our time reimagining, rethinking, and then working towards repair and renovation and revolution. Yes, because we ought to be thinking about the broken world and how we might repair it. And that's what I try to do every day. So you begin with that question, where do we go from here? That makes me want to name this political moment. And I think we are in a very dangerous, very fraught, very troubling political moment, social moment in our country and in the world. But I hasten to add, it's not the first time, it's not the only time, it's not the worst time. It is a tough time, but you can become very myopic, very nearsighted, and say, "Oh, everything's going to hell, and it's never been like this." That's not true. We have had these kinds of problems before. We've had fascism before, and we are entering into an era where we need to all pay attention, but not to allow ourselves to despair. Anger, yes. Sadness, yes. Grief, possibly, but not despair, because despair makes us powerless. It disarms us. We have to get together, rally, and be our best selves. I urge myself and my people to gather in small groups, to find your people, to break bread together, to find joy and happiness with each other, and then to use that as a springboard to resist the worst aspects of what we're witnessing in our political landscape.
So, and then it makes sense to me, because when you live a life, I'm amazed that I have survived all these years in academia. So if I'm saying that I go in on a day where Moral Mondays, Black Lives Matter, and it goes back times, may ask who can be arrested in an action today, and that means I got to go to the chair of my department and say I'm taking a personal day, and they say, well, that's good, and then they say, what is it? And I say that, well, we're going to gather at the Capitol today, and I'm going to block the street with a bunch of other radicals, and the same thing. I go to the deans and the same stuff. But so I'm surprised that, and I like this idea, because you don't have to, but this idea that I think when I'm talking to young scholars today and young teachers, and this that other side of me, that other side, I do teach my classes. I'm a clinical professor. So I have to teach you how to assess literacy and writing and all these things. And so there's a clinical aspect to what I do. But there's another part of me that shares that love. And the love. So I always tell people my radical is my love. That's what it is. And I think that might be similar. But if you had to give some advice right now to the young Yale interns at the New Haven Independent with Harry in the room, saying, well, who is Bill Ayers? They're going to say the same about me and that stuff. So let's give them some advice, because what I'm hearing, and I don't know what it's like in Chicago. I'm retiring this year. I'll be 70, and I'm retiring because I'm tired. I get tired of the minutia over there and stuff. So what advice would, because I'm always telling my teachers, you have to advocate. You have to fight back. Your pensions are less than mine. Your benefits are less than mine. Your pay, adjusted for inflation, is less than mine. That's not the way the world was meant to be. You're restricted in what you teach in so many ways. So give them some advice. Tell them, share that stuff, gather joy, break bread. I think it will keep them in the profession.
Well, I would say this, Jesse, that um, first of all, I would say that I give very little advice to young people. I take advice from young people. I've always had mentors. My mentors have always been older than me, but now that I've reached 80, my mentors tend to be younger than me. And all my life as a teacher has been, based on the principle that the best teachers are students of their students. So my advice to all of us is to listen to our students, listen to the young, listen to the active. But having said that, I have a couple of notes. One is that I think if you've gone into teaching, if you're going into teaching, of course you want to have a career, you want to have a job, you want to have a pension, you want to have healthcare benefits and all that. That's right. But you didn't go into teaching for those things. The fundamental reason you went into teaching had to do with your own sense of making a difference in the world, in the lives of other people. And maybe you had a vision of something that you cared about in the world: music, math, quadratic equations that you wanted to share with young people. Maybe you had a sense of yourself being a better person when you were helping other people. Whatever it was, stay in touch with that core belief about what makes teaching special. Teachers touch the future. Teachers are world-changing people. We might not change the world on our own, but we do change the people who change the world. The last thing I would say is I think there's a rhythm to being an activist, to being a good organizer, to being a good resident or citizen. And the rhythm is easy to say and excruciatingly difficult to practice. But I'll say it very simply. You cannot be a good citizen, a good activist, a moral person, unless you open your eyes and pay attention to the world as it really is. You have to be awake. You have to see the world. Secondly, you have to be astonished. You have to be astonished at the unnecessary suffering and pain that human beings visit upon one another. But you also have to be astonished at the joy, the ecstasy, the beauty all around us. If you're not astonished, I often remind myself, if I ever get used to seeing homeless kids in Chicago, I'm finished. I have to be astonished every time. I have to weep every time. So we open our eyes, we pay attention, we're astonished. The third thing you have to do is you have to act on whatever the known demands. Your knowledge will be incomplete. You don't know everything. You have to do something. My students often say, I can't do everything. The request is not that you do everything, it's that you do something. And if you do something, whether it's a demonstration or a protest or, a piece of art, an act of resistance, a letter to the editor, whatever you do, you must do something. And then the fourth step is you have to rethink. You have to wonder if what you did was really worthwhile. And I have a pedagogical standard that I use on step 4. And the pedagogical standard is, did I teach and did I learn? If I taught and I learned, then perhaps that action was worthwhile. If I didn't teach and I didn't learn, but I thought I looked terrific on the front page of the Chicago Sun-Times, that's not good enough. You have to have a sense that you are interacting in the world, in relationship, building community, building a movement. So my advice is, you know, wake up, pay attention, act, doubt, repeat. The only other piece of advice I have that is really fundamental to my way of thinking is resist being self-righteous. If you're self-righteous, if you know everything, you may be right on this issue or that issue, but your self-righteousness is wrong. And I think it's very important that we check ourselves and we say, okay, I feel passionate about this and I'm out there working. But as soon as I feel I'm better than everybody else because of my precious idea, I'm in trouble. So I think that those are the frameworks of any advice I might offer. But as I say, I mainly want to get advice from the folks I work with in Chicago, from the Chicago Abortion Fund, from the Let Us Breathe Collective, from the undocumented and unafraid young people. All these people are the people who advise me.
So my advice is young people, start reading, start listening to Bill's podcast. And I want to, there's an example in your book. And I love history, but the example goes back to Chicago. So I don't know, maybe the number was 15 or 20 people. Slavery days, gathering together. And you make the point, knowing that, not realizing 20 years from now, slavery will end. They have no clue. Probably because I felt myself at times like this, when will we change? But they had no clue that their gathering was helping to plant the seed to a liberation that they dreamed of their entire lives. Talk about a little bit about that, because this gathering, that's this love, that's this joy, that's this breaking bread. I don't think, and I try to imagine if I was an abolitionist in the 1850s or even 1840s, and I try to think if I was part of that movement, could I ever imagine what was going to happen? And so share that, because I think that's a major, that chapter alone is worth the price of the book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Jesse, I would hasten to add that 70 years or 80 years, it's a long time in the life of a person, but it's the blink of an eye in the life of a struggle. And we have to remember that it feels like we've been at this forever and when will it ever change? But the thought experiment that I have in the book is exactly this. You're an abolitionist. It's 1850. And you're gathered, like we're gathered here, Jesse and Harry and our audience, and here we are. And we're against slavery, and we're determined to be a part of a movement that will end slavery. But it's 1850. So we are sitting around a table. We're against the Constitution. We're against the founders. We're against the law. We're against our preacher. We're against the Bible. We're against our parents. We're against our neighbors. But damn, we're right. We think slavery is an abomination. We think it's an evil seed in our country. We want to abolish it. So we're having a meeting. And we agree that some of us will knock doors. Some of us will support candidates. Some of us will write leaflets and editorials. Some of us will build an underground. We'll do all these things. We'll be active in our expression of being anti-slavery. But in 1850, the idea that we could end that institution, which was so ingrained in the very fiber of this country, how would it be? You're fantasizing. You're a utopian. You're an idealist. And yet it happened. And I think that should give us courage today to say, okay, we have our freedom dreams. We have our abolitionist desires. But what are we doing about it? We need to do something. Let me give you one other example, Jesse, just to bring it closer to the present. Two of my students currently were on death row in Illinois, one for 11 years, one for 13 years. They're both now out of prison, commuted. Their sentences were commuted. One was part of the Innocence Project. He did not commit the crime he was accused of. One, as he says, I was guilty, but I'm still human. I was wrongfully sentenced. Both of these guys are amazing. But 20 years ago, Illinois did away with the death penalty. 10 years before that, these two men were young men, and they were sitting on death row. And they said to each other, we need to end the death penalty in Illinois. And they gathered together in a law school class. They made a class to study the law on death row. Now, you think you've got it bad, or you think your circumstances are tough. Here are these guys on death row, some wrongfully convicted, all of them wrongfully sentenced. And they build an organization called the Death Row 10. And then they get their mothers involved and they build an organization called the Mothers of the Death Row 10. They begin to go out into the community through students who get excited about it, involved in it. They get journalists and lawyers involved. And in a 10-year campaign, they abolish the death penalty in Illinois. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because they were determined. Now, everything doesn't work out this way, but they were determined. They had a dream. They built that dream on concrete activity, and they won. I think that gives me courage to say, okay, my dreams may sound utopian to you, but they are real. I can imagine a world that could be or should be, but is not yet. I'm willing to work hard to bring that world into view.
Perfect, perfect, and that's the nature. So I'll give you an example from Central Connecticut State University. We, in 1853, we had a black graduate named Don Carlos Ebenezer Bassett. He became America's first black ambassador, significant abolitionist, became the principal at Cheney School for Colored Boys, which becomes the first historically black college. He also, and we got note of this, our university didn't really mention his life much, and what happens is one of the consulate people from DC wind up in the Haitian consulate office, and he asked who that person is over there, and they said, that's the hero Hispaniola, that's your boy. And Bassett, so we launched on a 15-year campaign with a group of faculty members and staff at the university and the community, ministers, all kinds of people. Every month we went to our board of regents because we felt there was no state building named after any black person in our state. And we felt we had a worthy person, a significant man who had saved thousands of lives in Hispaniola. So but to come back, so he's kind of like a Schindler's List person in this sense. And he does it when Ulysses S. Grant tells him he can't. Do nothing. You're an ambassador. Do nothing. That's their problem. And he secretly kept bringing people into the compound so they didn't get brutalized, they didn't get beaten, they didn't get killed. And he arranged for the safe transportation for them to go to Jamaica. But anyway, with 15 years, we would go every month. We'd go to our presidents of our universities. Our current president was very supportive, Zuma Torre. She's the only Hispanic president of our university. We are, I think we're 176 years old now, and she's the only female. So if you look at our founders hall, it's all white men over there. But she supported us. But every month, about 15 to 30 of us would go to the Board of Regents to use the public speaking and use that to tell them a story. And they'd always say, oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Finally, in the last year of that 15-year, one of the presidents of the board said, well, I really can't do anything about it. Every building, every room, every door at our universities has a price tag. And a building's price tag is $5 to $6 million. Now that just launched us into a frenzy, and we just launched the full assault on that. But I'm saying that it's sort of like when we first gathered under that tree, when we first gathered and we broke bread together, we had a dream. To be honest, we probably didn't think we would get that dream, but it did. And I do have a famous picture that I love with everybody outside when we got the building approved, and it was the dedication and stuff. And I say to people, that's the only real victory that I can point to, total victory. Mm. So that kind of idea that yes, we can have a vision of a better world. At that time, when Ebenezer came to our university, Bill, we had a black student at Trinity and a black student at Yale. None of them were allowed to sit in the classroom. One was told you sit by the door. One was told you sit by the window. Ebenezer was allowed integrated before they had desegregation. He was admitted to the university, the outstanding student, becomes our valedictorian. And what's interesting, his thesis was the true teacher in that sense over there. And when we look at him, we always say, what would his advice be to us? Defend the students inside the classroom, defend them in the schoolhouse, defend them outside the schoolhouse, defend them in the world. So I think that stuff matters. Can you give us another take of another group? I mean, if I go through the book, there's a bunch of chapters. I could pick them all out, and
I appreciate that.
12 shows on this. But give us another example of a group of people who had a vision, who gathered, broke bread, and did it like you gave us one. I mean, I wrote it down in the chapter, Death Row 10. Then I had to write real quickly, the mothers of Death Row 10. You
Right.
give us abolitionists. Let's get another one because I want
Well, I think first of all, I think it's very important to note that when we think of abolition, of course, we always think of the abolition of slavery, which is correct. I mean, it's a monumental moment in world history. And we think of Frederick Douglass, but the canon, the writing about abolition goes back way beyond that. It goes back to the Bible, and writing on abolition comes up. There's a canon now, not only Angela Davis, but Miriam Kaba and Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Erica Miners. There's so much been written. And my little book is an attempt to add another utterance into that growing canon toward abolition. And what do we mean by abolition? First of all, it doesn't mean simply unlocking the gate. It doesn't mean simply freeing the slaves. It means, at its best, abolition is world building. What kind of a world would we need to build where slavery was unthinkable and unacceptable? What kind of a world would we need to build where mass incarceration wasn't on anybody's map of how to create a flourishing and safe society? I think it's really important to note that abolition is naming an obstacle and then saying we need to eliminate that obstacle to human flourishing, to human freedom. So one of the paradoxes in the book that I talk about a lot is the paradox of freedom is that you're never more free than when you're standing in opposition to unfreedom. And that's a very interesting way to think about it, because you could be free sitting on your couch smoking a joint. I'm not against it, but that's not where freedom comes to life. And I do describe a couple of stories. One, Frederick Douglass, one the resistance fighter in France, and one a Black Panther in Los Angeles named William Farr, who was who was in the Black Panther office in the early 1970s when the Los Angeles police assaulted the Panther office and the Panthers were barricaded inside. And years later, Stanley Nelson, who made the brilliant film, The Black Panther Party, Vanguard of the Revolution, he interviews the survivors of the LA shootout, and William Farr is one of them. And he says to Farr, well, what was that like? And Farr says, well, it was an amazing moment because they were shooting in, bam, bam, bam. We were shooting out, bam, bam, bam. We knew we couldn't escape. They couldn't get in. And he said, but you know what? For those 3 hours, quote, I felt like a free Negro, unquote. Wow. How is that possible? Well, Frederick Douglass says something very similar. He reaches a moment where his master's son is about to beat him again, and he fights back, and he beats the kid, and he beats him up, and he could have killed him. He decides not to, but he does defeat him. And he says, it's weird because even though I knew I would be punished, even though I knew I was still enslaved, I felt free for that moment of fighting back. I think there's something very touching and very important for us in that. You experience freedom in the middle of a street demonstration objecting to the murder of George Floyd. You feel freedom when you're in an encampment objecting to the genocide in Gaza. Those are the places where freedom comes to life. Nelson Mandela describes feeling free, locked into a dungeon because he was fighting apartheid. I think that's a really important insight from the freedom fighters of the past.
So we have an array of voices in historic history, in social civil rights, for rights to end slavery, for economic justice, all kinds of. We have a rich history. We also have a rich history in literature, a rich history in history itself over there. I'd like to ask you a question, because when I'm looking at the chapters, and you have immersed so much literature, so much poetry, that I feel like I need to go back and take that freshman literature course again. And we do share lots of poets and lots of literature that I love, but and maybe I should point this out. I have a president in the White House right now who I have never heard cite one piece of literature, one biblical quote. I mean, usually he doesn't do it. It's huge, it's big, it's beautiful. I've never heard anything in the Bible or the Quran or the Torah where some leader stood, maybe Moses stood on the rock and said, "What I'm going to do, this is going to be beautiful. It's going to be bigly." So this idea, and I've never heard a leader not be able to quote literature. Tell us about that. What does literature do for you?
I think it's hugely important to note that every autocracy, every authoritarian government, one of the first things they do is they attack books, they attack libraries, they attack schools and universities, they attack the arts. For this president to make himself the chairman of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., is an abomination. And for him not to be able to turn to literature. And why is literature so important, and poetry? Because the imaginative arts show us a world that could be or should be, but is not yet. And I'm thinking of art and imagination not simply as castles in the sky, but as pointing to what could be, what should be. And what literature does for you, and I'm now saying this to all of us and to young students, literature allows you to live more than one life. You can live many, many lives through books, and you're never alone through books. And I urge all of us to read books from beginning to end. One of the weird things, one of my weird habits is when I start a book, I must finish it. I never stop in the middle because I want to know where it's going to go. And sometimes the books aren't that good. But I think it's hugely important that we stand up for the right to read. Free people read freely. One of the messages I want my students to get all the time is you have every right to be here, and you need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You don't need your parents, you don't need me, you don't need another teacher, and you don't need the government to tell you what to interrogate or where to look. You need no one's permission to interrogate the world. So while I'm appalled at the attack on schools and universities, I don't think that that's the last word. Freedom schools will spring up. Reading groups will spring up. And it happens everywhere. Working in prison is revelatory for me because these folks read religiously. They read to be free, and they read to find freedom. One of my students, one of the gentlemen that I mentioned who got off death row and has been out of prison now for 4 years, I asked him, how did you get out and hit the road running? How did you not spend years and years readjusting? He'd been in for 38 years. I said, how did you come out so together? He said two things. He said, I lived my life in prison as if I were free, and I read. Reading is a path to liberation. So I think it's hugely important to read, and I'm a slow reader actually, but I mine my reading for all kinds of resources. So that's why you see a lot of things quoted in the book, because I milk the resources that I have for what they can give me. And frankly, a life in reading is a life of possibility, really.
So a life in reading is a life of possibility. Love that concept. And this idea of, and people are unaware, if we're not reading, and not reading because someone told us to read. I usually
Exactly.
if I tell you to read something, you should question why I'm asking you to do that. Every author, everyone who tells you to read something is trying to persuade you to think like them or be like them or somehow. Although I tend to say as a professor, I just want you to think. I don't care what you think. I want you to think.
That's so interesting that you say it that way, because I was at a lecture that Ta-Nehisi Coates gave recently in Chicago, the brilliant, brilliant author of Between the World and Me and The Beautiful Struggle. And Coates was asked by an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, what should I read? What should I put on my reading list? And Coates said, if I told you what to read, that would be my reading list. My advice is to go into the library and read everything. And she said, well, I can't read everything. He said, no, start and then follow your own mind and your own desires and your own experience. Read everything, make your own reading list. And I thought that was really powerful, powerful advice. Um, you know, reading is a pathway, but it's not the only pathway. The other is action in the world, building relationships, being active in the world. I think I want to add one other thing, Jesse, and that is that, I'm often accused by friends and foes alike of being an optimist. And I am not an optimist. I am a hopeful person. But to me, an optimist shares something very serious with a pessimist. And that is, they both know how things are going to turn out. The pessimist is a cynic and looks at the world as, we're going to hell. The optimist is waving happily from the window. But both of them know how things are going to turn out. Because I have no idea how things are going to turn out, I choose to be hopeful. That's why I get up every morning and look at that line from Mary Oliver, just to be alive on this fresh morning in the broken world. I wake up and I say, today we can change things. I may go to bed at night disappointed, but I guarantee you, tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll have the same exact response. I want to get busy in acts of repair, acts of reimagination, and so on. So while I'm not an optimist, I am a hopeful person, and that's a choice that I make. I'm also a bit of an idealist, a bit of a utopian. I don't know if you know the Latin American author Eduardo Galeano. He wrote a book called Open Veins in Latin America, and I was having dinner with him about 30 years ago, and and Galliano said, I'm always accused of being a utopian. I said, I am too. And he said, somebody said to me, what good is utopia? And I said, this is Galliano speaking. I said, it's true. If I take 2 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 2 steps away. If I walk 10 steps towards utopia, utopia walks 10 steps away. So what good is utopia? And Galliano's answer was, it's good for walking. And that's how I have experienced hope. It's good for walking. It's good for putting you on track to where you want to go.
Perfect, perfect. And that's the stuff like in my family. Often people say you're not aging. You seem to be forever young, like the Dylan song and stuff. They'll say, and I'll say it's very much what we're just talking about now. That it's sort of like I tell people I'm a man of La Mancha. I can't accept the world as it is. So, and I don't mind dying to make it a better world. I don't really have that issue and that piece. And I never think that the work is going to be done. I don't really feel that. I think it's like Dr. King, in Memphis saying, I've been to the mountain. I know what it's like on the other side. I may not get there with you, but I will be there when you get there. So I often feel that. And that is a youthful love that inspires and keeps me going. That in my life. And so
yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's very important because, and one of the things you're reminding me of, Jesse, is that I don't think that we should be nostalgic for a ship that already left the shore. As I say, 70 years is a long time in the life of a person, not so long in the life of a struggle. But there's no need to be nostalgic. In fact, nostalgia or looking backwards and saying, oh, everything was perfect, not only is it wearing rose-colored glasses, but it paralyzes us in the present. You and I may be now senior citizens among the elderly, but we're both looking forward. We're looking at what's next. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't know some history, but we shouldn't be tied to it and we shouldn't romanticize it. We should be using history as a vehicle to move forward because we're alive now and we're alive in a world that's broken and in need of repair. We should get busy and be part of that world.
Get busy, be part of that world. And so I want to go back to a little something. I'm going to ask you about the freedom schools, and we're getting ready. We probably got about 10 minutes left or something, so I hope I don't occupy too much time. But as I think about the freedom schools history, I also think about uh, I'm the child of Irish immigrants. So we all know, we learn, at least some of us learned, but my grandfather made sure we understood about the hedge schools in Ireland, the penal codes that outlawed our language, our history, our schools, forbid education to us for 200 years. So from, I think it's 1660, I forget, to somewhere in the 1800s, it's a long time, that our history, our language, our culture, our music was not allowed to be taught, and that's an oppressor controlling it. But so, what did the community do? I think they did what you're talking about. They met under the tree. They said,
Absolutely.
"Who in this community could teach our children, and we'll keep it a secret, and we'll do it by the hedges, and we'll give you food. We'll help you out because you need to stop your farming. You need to stop being the merchant. You need to stop earning some money to do this for us." So those hedge schools and freedom schools, they have a similarity, and I'm amazed at my students have not heard of the freedom schools, many of them.
Well, it's interesting because you're right. The hedge schools were an oppressive institution. You think about the Indian boarding schools that lasted up until this century, where you were stripped of everything native in order to occupy the lowest rung in the majority culture. You think about some of the other attempts to miseducate and de-educate people. You remember the famous statement by Frederick Douglass when his master discovered that his wife, the master's wife, was teaching Douglass to read. The master exploded and said, "Reading will unfit him to be a slave." And that's exactly right. Reading, knowledge, enlightenment will unfit you to be a slave. So the freedom schools were a conscious attempt, and they echo the schools in Brazil that Paulo Freire worked on, and so on. Many examples from around the world. But the freedom schools were part of the civil rights movement, and it came at a time when there was a downturn in the energy of the civil rights movement. People like to tell a story of the civil rights movement that's pure fantasy, that there was once a bad time in America, then a great leader came along, had a dream, made a speech, and now we're all better. None of that is true. All of that is wipes away the struggle and the hard-fought nature of what the movement was. But in 1963, Charles Cobb, who was a volunteer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, came up with an idea, and he wrote a proposal, not to the MacArthur Foundation, not to the Education Department. He wrote a proposal to his friends, and it said, "We need to create schools." It started by saying, "The Black children of Mississippi have been denied many things: decent facilities, forward-looking curriculum, fully trained teachers. But the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise." Now, that's a revolutionary statement right there. Think about the circumstances of your lives and how they could be otherwise. In medieval Mississippi, that was threatening. And notably, the three famous martyrs of Mississippi, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were all freedom school teachers. And they were investigating the bombing of a freedom school, the arson bombing of a freedom school, when they were kidnapped and lynched. So it's got revolutionary implications. Ask yourself these questions. What is my life like? How could it be different? Could it be more joyful, more just, more peaceful, more free? That's what the freedom schools fundamentally did. And then they created a curriculum, which you can find online, the 1963 Mississippi Freedom School curriculum. And it was a curriculum of questions. Why are you and I in the freedom movement? What do we hope to accomplish? What do we want to get rid of? And those were revolutionary questions, and they still are.
Revolutionary questions. Why not make the curriculum questions, right? Almost like the Socratic method. Ask your questions over there. That's Socrates. He could, after, if we discuss a series of questions, we will come to some kind of consensus on some pieces, or maybe we will agree to disagree. When we're talking about this piece, it reminds me. I spent a number of years working with Tohoto O'odham students on their reservation outside Tucson. Well, I was a doctoral student. That's how I tried to, make a living. I think we have some background noise, but when I think about it, an elder on the reservation asked me, what's your culture? White boy. He said, is it Reeboks? Is it MTV? Because I'm not so certain. And then he said, well, you should live your life. I'm going to give you some advice. Live your life as if you were going to die right now, and realize you don't have, when you ask the creator, can I have one more minute to call my mother? Can I have one more minute to call my brother who I've been fighting with and arguing? Can I have one more? And he said, you won't have that time. So you should live your life in a manner that makes your ancestors proud of that life. So I love that. And I think the Freedom School, because you reminded me, what my students may not always understand is the violent reaction to just asking questions.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I think the live your life as if it's your last is a very important. The curriculum was a curriculum of questions. The pedagogy was a pedagogy of dialogue. That's also important, critical.
Perfect. And these questions. So when we start thinking about this, now I want to come back to, because there's nothing that can hide from me what's going on in our world. South Houston, the state approved, appointed superintendent that nobody wanted, he closed all the libraries in the middle school and the high school. He closed his libraries in South Houston and turned them into testing centers, test and prep centers. I'm right down the road from Hartford Public Schools. And a number of the schools, elementary and high school, have somehow deemed it necessary or not necessary, have somehow got rid of their librarians and have actually closed down their libraries. So, and when Ndaba Mandela's son was here just at Martin Luther King's Day, we have a celebration over here, and he was our keynoter. And I asked him that question because he talked about this stuff that we probably have mentioned a little bit about banned books and things like that. And he said, read the books that they don't want you to read, And then I said, well, what do you think about this effort in our schools? Because someone asked him about banned books and stuff, and the effort being pushed by people in America right now to ban the books over there. And so I said, what do you think about, maybe I don't have to ban the books if I'm somebody who wants to oppress someone. What if I closed all the libraries? Then I ban all the books. So give us a little bit of what would happen if we close all the libraries. What do you think?
Well, I think that this is something that's actually underway. I think it's something that is part of the large project of closing the education department. Part of the large project of attacking universities is to create a nation of ignorance. And I think that we have to resist it. There's a lot of ways to resist it. One is to get on the library boards, to try to get elected to be part of the library. One thing is to imagine building book groups, reading groups, study groups outside of the institutions. I'll tell you one thing I'm involved in is I work with Haymarket Books. I'm on the board of Haymarket Books. And when they banned certain books in Florida, Haymarket Books sent thousands of copies of those very titles to youth groups that were working with kids in communities. That's the kind of thing we can do to resist and to make sure that people have access to knowledge, to information, to wisdom.
Perfect. So where it's almost like this, you can't see the door of my office, but it's the picture of Frederick Douglass, and of course it has that quote where he said, once you learn to read, you're forever free. So when Miss Maud, the mistress, who, by the way, I tell people, I say, remember, she's different than the other Southern belles. She had made her living as a seamstress, which is very unusual for a plantation owner to marry a working woman. So she was unaware of that. But Douglass, while the master forbid him to, and she stopped teaching him, he understood that it's not just the ABCs. It's how I'm going to find the star north. It's how I'm going to liberate my soul. It's how I'm going to change the world. at least my piece of it. So I love that concept, and I want us to. I want to get back to and this idea that we've got incarcerated people. I'm trying to think. I forget, one of the stories talks about we had a smaller prison population than I think Sweden. Just in the 70s. I forget, it was maybe 350,000. I may not, don't hold me to the numbers, but it was small. Now we're talking about millions. And if we're talking about the people that are on parole, that are wearing ankle bracelets, and we're talking about millions more. And the amount of money that's being spent, because incarceration can cost anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 a year, and maybe more, depending on death row inmates are not the cheap end of the. So, can we talk about this? How can we end this concept of prison? As I feel, if we closed all the prisons today, the stock market would crash. That's what I feel.
Well, it's funny. To me, you've just asked the $64,000 question, because here we are in Illinois. We have in terms of establishment politics, we have a very good governor, Governor Pritzker. He's very progressive on many issues. We closed Stateville Prison, which is where I taught for many years. And it should have been closed. It was a medieval dungeon. It was toxic. But then the governor puts into next year's budget $900 million to build a new prison. And immediately, those of us who are involved in these kinds of reforms rise up and begin to say to him, look, $900 million, we could stop the front end. We could build better schools. We could house the homeless. We could have arts centers, drug treatment centers, and we could go on and on. If you want Illinois to be a flourishing and functional and safe state, don't invest in prisons, invest in communities. And so we're in this struggle right now. I don't know the way to do it, but I would say that for the last 20 years, since Michelle Alexander wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, we have had a conversation in this country that identifies mass incarceration as an abomination, as something that is not only horrible, but it takes money away from everything else. So we had a conference last week up at Northeastern Illinois University.
He's going to start playing the music. So, I mean, we got all the good stuff. That just says to me, my friends in China, I've been to China a number of times, and my Chinese friend said, you always need to leave something for next time. So this means we have to come back. And I want to know about these Haymarket books. I want you to bring some friends. We can have one of those under the tree conversations.
Let's do it. It's really been a pleasure, Jesse, and I appreciate your inviting me on.
And we want back, and we want some of your friends back. And we want to get radical, because radical is how I show my love for the world. Thank you.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound?